You're not lost. You're just living on autopilot. You drove home today or made coffee or scrolled through your phone for 20 minutes, and if someone asked you right now to describe exactly what you were thinking during any of those moments, you probably couldn't. Not because something is wrong with you, but because you weren't really there. That's not a dramatic statement. It's just what happens when a life becomes familiar enough to run itself. The routines lock in. The responses become automatic. The days start to blur, not into chaos but into something quieter and harder to name. A kind of smoothness that feels fine on the surface and oddly empty underneath. Most people who feel disconnected from their lives don't look disconnected. They show up, they function, they answer messages, meet deadlines, make plans. From the outside, everything seems to be working. But internally, there's a growing sense that something is missing. Not something dramatic, not a crisis, just presence. The feeling of actually being inside your own life while it's happening. And the strange part is that this doesn't arrive suddenly. There's no moment where you decide to stop paying attention. It happens the way most significant things happen, gradually, quietly, until one day you notice that you can't remember the last time you felt genuinely present in your own experience. Marcus Aurelius wrote to himself in the Meditations, Book 4, Paragraph 3, that very little is needed to make a happy life, and that it is all within yourself, in your way of thinking. He wasn't writing about contentment in the abstract. He was writing as a man who understood, from personal experience, how easy it is to let the mind drift from the actual moment, and how much it costs when it does. The Stoics didn't treat presence as a spiritual luxury. They treated it as a discipline, a daily practice of returning again and again to conscious engagement with what is actually happening, not because it was easy, because the alternative was a life lived at a distance from itself. And that's exactly what this video is about. Not being lost, not being broken, not needing to overhaul your life or find some dramatic new direction. This is about something more specific, and in some ways, more urgent. It's about the quiet, gradual process by which a person stops inhabiting their own experience, and what it takes to come back. Because you were never really gone, you just stop noticing that you were here. You don't notice when it begins. It doesn't start with a breakdown. It doesn't start with a bad decision or a moment of crisis. It starts with something so ordinary that you wouldn't think to question it. You get in the car and drive to work. You arrive and realize you have almost no memory of the journey. Not because something went wrong, because everything went exactly as expected. The route was familiar, the movements were automatic, and your mind was somewhere else entirely. Technically, you were there. Consciously, you weren't. That's the first sign. And most people miss it completely because it doesn't feel like a problem. It feels like efficiency. The same thing happens at the end of the day. You sit down and someone asks what you did, and you can give a general answer. Meetings, emails, lunch, a few tasks, but the texture of the day is gone. The specific moments, the small details, the actual experience of moving through those hours, mostly absent. The day happened. You just weren't fully inside it while it did. This is what autopilot actually looks like. Not dysfunction, not collapse. A life that continues moving forward with remarkable smoothness, while the person living it gradually fades into the background of their own experience. And here's what makes it so difficult to catch early. From the outside and even from the inside, everything appears to be working. You're meeting your responsibilities, you're maintaining your relationships, you're doing what needs to be done. There's no obvious alarm, no clear signal that something important is slipping. Marcus Aurelius wrote in the Meditations, Book 2, Paragraph 14, that a man's life is a mere moment, his existence a flux, his perception clouded. He was describing something precise, the way consciousness left unattended drifts, not toward disaster, toward absence, toward a kind of functional fog where the days accumulate without leaving much behind. The people who are deepest in this pattern often look the most put together. They've optimized their routines. They know exactly what to do and when to do it. Life runs smoothly because it barely requires them anymore. And the feeling that comes with that isn't always obvious distress. Sometimes it's just a quiet flatness, a sense that the days are passing faster than they should, that things which used to feel meaningful have started to feel neutral, that you're present in your life the way a background character is present in a story, technically there, but not really driving anything. The days move fast when you're not fully inside them, and somewhere underneath the routine, underneath the smoothness, there's a question that hasn't been asked yet. If this is what normal feels like, when did normal start to feel like this? Your brain loves repetition. Here's something your brain will never tell you directly. It is actively working to remove you from your own experience, not out of malice, out of efficiency. The brain's primary function is not to make you feel alive. It's to keep you alive with the least possible energy expenditure. And one of the most powerful tools it uses to do that is automation. When a behavior is repeated enough times, the brain stops consciously processing it and hands it off to systems that run below awareness. The technical term is habituation. The lived experience is invisibility. This is genuinely useful for basic survival. You don't need to consciously think about how to walk, how to use a fork, how to navigate a familiar environment. Those processes run in the background, so your conscious attention can focus elsewhere. In that context, automation is a feature. The problem begins when automation expands beyond motor tasks and starts consuming the parts of life that are supposed to require you. Your emotional responses become automatic. You encounter a situation that resembles something from the past, and before you've consciously processed it, you're already feeling a familiar feeling, running a familiar reaction, following a familiar pattern. You didn't choose the response, it loaded automatically, like a program that starts itself. Your social interactions become automatic. There are scripts for most conversations. How are you? Fine, thanks. How's work? Good, busy. These exchanges happen so smoothly that they barely register as real contact. You go through the motions of connection without the actual experience of it. Carl Jung wrote in Modern Man, In Search of a Soul, that the most terrifying thing is to accept oneself completely. But before that acceptance can happen, there has to be a self that is actually present, conscious, awake, capable of being encountered. Automation doesn't just remove effort, it removes the person. And this is the part that rarely gets named directly. You didn't just automate your habits, you automated your way of moving through life, the way you respond to people, the way you process your own emotions, the way you decide what deserves attention and what gets filtered out. All of it gradually handed off to systems that don't require your presence to function. Which means you can go through an entire day, a real day full of real moments, and emerge on the other side having barely participated in any of it. Your brain did its job perfectly. It kept everything running. It just didn't need you there to do it. And when emotions start running on the same automatic systems as habits, something more serious begins to take shape. You're reacting more than you're choosing. There's a version of yourself that you believe is making decisions. Conscious decisions, intentional ones, choices that reflect what you actually want, what you actually value, how you actually want to engage with your life. And then there's what's actually happening. Most of what feels like decision-making is pattern execution. Your brain encounters a situation, matches it to a stored template from past experience, and generates the same response it generated the last time something similar occurred. The response feels like a choice because it passes through your awareness, but the process that produced it was already complete before you became conscious of it. This plays out in small ways constantly. You pick up your phone not because you decided to, but because a moment of mild discomfort triggered an automatic reach for stimulation. You respond to a message in a certain tone, not because you chose that tone, but because the emotional pattern associated with that person or topic loaded before you had time to think. You say you're fine, not because you assessed your internal state and concluded that fine was accurate, but because fine is what comes out when the question arrives. None of these feel like automatic behaviors. They feel like you. And that's exactly what makes them so difficult to interrupt. Epictetus wrote in the Enchiridion, chapter 20, that no person is hurt by another, only by their own judgment of what is happening. This is a demanding idea, but underneath the philosophy is something precise and practical. The gap between stimulus and response is where conscious choice actually lives, and autopilot collapses that gap completely. When you're running on automation, there is no pause. There is no moment of genuine evaluation between what happens and how you respond. The situation arrives, the pattern fires, and the response is already out of time in words, in behavior, in emotional tone, before awareness had any real input. And here's the specific feeling that comes with living this way. It's not distress exactly. It's a subtle but persistent sense of disconnection from your own actions, like you're watching yourself respond to things rather than actually responding. Like the words coming out of your mouth are correct, but somehow not quite yours. Like you're slightly behind your own life, observing it rather than authoring it. You respond to messages without thinking. You open applications without intention. You move through interactions that are functionally successful and emotionally hollow. And the longer this continues, the less you notice the gap between who is actually running your life and whether that version of you was ever consciously chosen at all. Life feels faster. When you're disconnected, there's a question worth sitting with for a moment. When did the years start moving this fast? Not in the abstract sense that time passes, everyone knows that, but the specific personal experience of looking back at the last 6 months or the last year and finding it surprisingly thin. Not much texture, not many distinct memories, a general sense of what happened, but very little of the felt experience of living through it. Most people attribute this to being busy, to having too much happening, too many demands, not enough time to stop and breathe. But busyness alone doesn't explain it. Some of the most genuinely busy people feel deeply present in their lives, and some people with relatively manageable schedules feel like time is disappearing faster than they can account for. The real variable isn't how much is happening, it's how consciously you're inside it while it happens. Here's why. Memory doesn't record time equally. It records novelty, emotion, and attention, moments that are genuinely new, emotionally significant, or consciously engaged. Those get encoded with detail. They leave a trace. They become the landmarks that give a period of time its shape and texture. But moments that are automatic, familiar, and emotionally flat, those barely register. They pass through without leaving much behind. When most of your days are running on autopilot, most of your days are forgettable, not because nothing happened, but because nothing happened that required your full presence. And a year of forgettable days doesn't feel like a full year. It feels like a few weeks, compressed and indistinct. Marcus Aurelius wrote in the Meditations, Book 6, Paragraph 2, that it is not death that a man should fear, but he should fear never beginning to live. That line lands differently when you understand what he meant by living, not breathing and functioning, but being genuinely present and conscious inside the actual experience of your life. The Stoics were acutely aware of time, not in an anxious way, but in a clarifying one. Time was finite, and presence was the only thing that made it real. A day lived on autopilot wasn't really lived, it was processed. And there's a profound difference between processing your life and actually inhabiting it. The uncomfortable truth is that many people are processing years, moving through them efficiently, getting things done, maintaining the structure of a life, while the actual experience of those years remains thin, distant, and strangely unmemorable. And underneath that thinness, something even more unsettling has been quietly building. Something that goes beyond habits and memory. Something that starts to affect not just how you experience time, but how you experience yourself. You start becoming a character. At some point in this process, something subtle happens. You stop being the person living your life and start playing the role of the person living your life. And the difference between those two things is larger than it sounds. It begins with social performance. You learn over time what version of yourself works best in different contexts. What tone, what energy, what level of disclosure, what kind of humor, all calibrated to the environment. This is normal social adaptation, and at low levels, it's healthy. But when autopilot takes over, this calibration stops being conscious. It becomes a default mode, a character that loads automatically whenever other people are present. Carl Jung called this the persona, the social mask that mediates between the inner self and the outer world. Jung's concern wasn't that the persona exists, it's that people forget they're wearing it, that the mask worn long enough starts to feel like the face, and when that happens, something quietly shifts. The version of you that shows up in conversation, at work, in relationships, that version becomes increasingly efficient and decreasingly authentic. It knows what to say. It knows how to navigate. It produces the right responses, maintains the right appearances, keeps things moving. But internally, there's a growing distance between that performance and whatever is actually happening underneath it. You've probably felt this in a specific way. You're in a conversation, a real one, with someone who matters to you, and you're saying the right things, responding appropriately, smiling when it makes sense to smile. And somewhere behind all of that, there's a part of you that is watching the conversation happen rather than being inside it, present in form, absent in feeling. Or you're at an event, surrounded by people engaged in exactly the kind of social interaction that is supposed to feel meaningful. And you feel oddly alone. Not lonely in a dramatic way, just separate. Like there's a layer of glass between you and the actual experience of being there. This is what the persona feels like when it's running on autopilot. Functional, smooth, and completely disconnected from the interior life that it's supposed to be expressing. Epictetus wrote in the Discourses, Book 1, Chapter 2, that each person must know their own character and act in accordance with it, not the character that has been shaped by repetition and social pressure, the actual one, the one that requires presence to access. And the longer you operate as the character instead of the person, the harder it becomes to remember the difference. Sometimes you are talking, smiling, working, and internally you don't feel like you're really there. That feeling has a name, and it's been building much longer than you probably realize. The problem isn't that you're too busy. Here's the explanation most people reach for when they feel disconnected. Life is too fast. There's too much happening. Too many demands, too many notifications, too many competing priorities. If only things slowed down, if only there was more time, they would finally feel present again. It's a convincing story, and it's mostly wrong. The problem isn't the pace. The problem is fragmentation. The constant low-grade splitting of attention across dozens of inputs simultaneously, none of which receives enough focus to create genuine engagement, and all of which collectively prevent the kind of sustained presence that makes experience feel real. Think about what a typical hour actually looks like. A task open on one screen, a conversation happening in a separate window, a notification pulling attention to a third thing, a background awareness of something that needs to be handled later, a half-formed thought about something from earlier. At no point is the full weight of your attention on any single thing. At no point are you completely inside any one moment. Everything is being processed at partial capacity, and partial attention produces partial experience. You're technically present everywhere and genuinely present nowhere. What makes this particularly insidious is that it doesn't feel like distraction in the obvious sense. You're not wasting time. You're not being careless. You're managing a genuinely complex set of demands, and you're doing it reasonably well. The fragmentation feels like competence, like the ability to hold many things at once. But the mind wasn't designed for sustained fragmentation. It was designed for focus, periods of genuine, undivided engagement with one thing at a time. And when that natural rhythm is replaced by constant splitting, something starts to erode. Not productivity, necessarily. Presence. The felt sense of actually being somewhere with someone, doing something that registers as real. Seneca wrote in Letters to Lucilius, Letter 1, that we should reclaim time, gather it, save it. He was writing in a world without smartphones or social media, and the principle is more urgent now than it was then. Because the modern environment is specifically designed to fragment attention. Every platform, every notification, every algorithmically optimized feed is built to pull focus away from the present moment and redirect it, endlessly, invisibly, toward something else. You are not too busy to be present. You are too fragmented to feel it. And the consequence of sustained fragmentation isn't just distraction. It's the slow disappearance of the internal silence that allows you to notice yourself at all. Because when silence disappears, something important becomes impossible to hear. Silence starts to reveal things. There's a reason most people fill every available moment with noise. Not because they enjoy noise particularly, not because silence is objectively unpleasant, but because silence does something that noise prevents. It allows whatever has been running quietly in the background to become audible. And for someone who has been living on autopilot for a long time, that's not always a comfortable thing to hear. Think about what happens in the moments when distraction isn't available, waiting in line without your phone, lying awake before sleep arrives, a commute without music or a podcast. In those moments, something surfaces, a low-level restlessness, a vague dissatisfaction that doesn't attach itself to any specific cause. A question that doesn't quite form into words, but is clearly there, just underneath the surface. Most people respond to that feeling by reaching for the nearest available distraction, the phone, the show, the scroll. Not because they made a conscious decision to avoid the feeling, but because the reach happens automatically, before the feeling has time to fully arrive. And that automatic reach is one of the clearest signs that autopilot is running deep. Because what it reveals isn't just a preference for stimulation, it's an aversion to interior contact, a trained avoidance of the experience of simply being with yourself, unmediated, without anything to process or consume. Here's the uncomfortable part. Silence doesn't create emptiness. It reveals the emptiness that was already there, the one that was being covered moment by moment by the constant movement of distraction. When the movement stops, the emptiness becomes visible, and for someone who hasn't sat with it in a long time, that can feel genuinely unsettling. Marcus Aurelius wrote in the Meditations, Book 4, Paragraph 3, that nowhere can man find a quieter or more untroubled retreat than in his own soul. He described the practice of turning inward, not as escape but as return, as a deliberate act of reclaiming contact with the interior life that the external world constantly pulls attention away from. But here's what he understood, that the modern world has largely forgotten. That capacity, the ability to be genuinely still, genuinely present with your own interior experience, atrophies without practice. Like any other capacity, it weakens when unused. And when it weakens enough, even short periods of silence become uncomfortable. Not because something is wrong inside you, because you've lost the habit of being there. That's why you sometimes pick up your phone without any reason. Not boredom exactly, not a specific thing you want to check, just the automatic interruption of a moment that was beginning to require your actual presence. The silence wasn't empty. It was full of something you hadn't made space to feel yet. And it's exactly in that space, the one you've been avoiding, that the Stoics found something worth paying attention to. Marcus Aurelius fought this every single day. Here's something that gets lost in how Marcus Aurelius is often presented. He is held up as a model of Stoic discipline, a man of extraordinary equanimity, philosophical clarity, and consistent virtue. And he was all of those things. But the Meditations, his private journals, tell a more honest story. They are not a record of a man who had figured it out. They are a record of a man who had to remind himself, daily, repeatedly, sometimes with evident frustration, to return to the principles he believed in, to come back to presence, to resist the pull toward distraction, complaint, and mechanical living. He wrote in the Meditations, Book 5, Paragraph 1, telling himself to get up in the morning, not reluctantly, not resentfully, but with intention. He had to argue himself into consciousness each day. He had to remind himself that the work of being awake was not automatic, that it required active, repeated recommitment. This is a man governing an empire, managing military campaigns, dealing with political complexity that most people will never encounter. And his private writing is full of reminders to simply be present, to not drift, to not let the day run itself while he went somewhere else mentally. That's not a failure of philosophy. That's the honest reality of what staying conscious actually requires. Because here's what the Stoics understood, that modern self-improvement culture often misses. Presence is not a state you achieve. It's a practice you maintain. There is no point at which you become permanently awake, permanently engaged, permanently free from the pull of autopilot. The pull is always there. The drift is always possible. What changes is your ability to notice when it's happening and your willingness to return. Marcus didn't fight distraction and unconscious living because he was undisciplined. He fought it because he understood what was at stake. In the Meditations, Book 10, Paragraph 8, he wrote that the first rule is to keep an untroubled spirit, and that the second is to look things in the face and know them for what they are. Not to drift past them, not to process them automatically from a distance. To actually see them, to be genuinely present with what is real. That practice of returning again and again to conscious engagement wasn't something Marcus did once and completed. It was the work of a lifetime. Every day began with the same basic question. Am I actually here? Am I actually choosing how I engage with this moment? Or am I letting the moment run itself? That question is just as relevant now as it was 2,000 years ago. And answering it honestly, really honestly, requires something that most people find surprisingly difficult. It requires noticing how much you didn't realize was running without you. Waking up is uncomfortable. There's a version of increased awareness that gets presented as immediately clarifying. You become more conscious, you see your patterns, things make more sense, and you feel better, lighter, more aligned. That version is real, but it comes later. Before it arrives, there's something else. When you genuinely begin to increase your awareness, when you start paying real attention to how automatic your responses are, how fragmented your attention has become, how much of your day runs without your genuine participation. The initial experience is not relief, it's discomfort, a specific low-grade discomfort that comes from seeing clearly something you'd been successfully not seeing. You start noticing the reach for the phone before you've consciously decided to reach. You catch yourself mid-sentence in a social interaction, running a script rather than actually speaking. You finish a meal and realize you tasted almost none of it. You sit down to do something meaningful and observe, from a slight interior distance, how quickly and automatically your mind moves toward avoidance. None of these observations feel good initially. Because what they reveal collectively is the degree to which large portions of your daily experience have been happening on autopilot, and the degree to which that has been the case for longer than you'd like to admit. Epictetus wrote in the Enchiridion, chapter 48, that the position and character of a philosopher is to look for nothing from the outside, but only from within themselves. That inward turn, when it happens honestly, is not always comfortable. It requires seeing what is actually there, rather than what you assumed was there. And what is actually there for most people who have been living unconsciously for a sustained period is a gap. A significant gap between the life they're technically living and the life they're genuinely experiencing, between the person they believe themselves to be when they're not paying attention and the person who actually shows up when they are. That gap is uncomfortable to see, but seeing it is not the problem. It's the beginning of the solution. Because you can't close a gap you haven't acknowledged. You can't return to something you haven't noticed you left. The discomfort of awareness is not a sign that something is going wrong. It's the sign that something is finally going right, that the part of you capable of genuine observation is waking up after a long period of operating on low power. You begin to notice how many parts of your life have been functioning without you. Your reactions, your habits, your emotional patterns, your daily rhythms, all of it running smoothly, efficiently, and largely independent of your conscious participation. And that realization leads directly to the most important question this video will ask. If you stopped right now, who would be living your life? This is the question that most people never ask. Not because it's too abstract, but because it's too close. Take a moment with it, not as a philosophical exercise, as a genuine inquiry. If you removed your conscious participation from your daily life, your actual, present, deliberate engagement, how much would change? How many of your responses, your habits, your emotional reactions, your social interactions would continue running exactly as they are, simply because they've been running that way long enough to no longer require you? For most people who have been living on autopilot, the honest answer is uncomfortable. Quite a lot would continue. The routines are established. The patterns are grooved. The responses are rehearsed. Life has become in many significant ways self-executing. It doesn't need your presence to function. It just needs your body to show up. And that's not a moral failure. It's not laziness or weakness. It's what happens when a life becomes familiar enough and repetitive enough and sufficiently insulated from genuine novelty that the person at its center is no longer strictly necessary for it to continue. Marcus Aurelius confronted this directly in the Meditations, Book 3, paragraph 16, where he wrote that a man's life is a mere moment, and that it is squandered by inattention and self-neglect. He wasn't describing dramatic neglect. He was describing exactly this, the quiet erosion of conscious presence from a life that continues to function regardless. The way a person can be fully operational and barely there simultaneously. The Stoics had a specific word for the opposite of this state. They called it prohairesis, the faculty of conscious choice, the capacity to genuinely author your responses rather than simply execute them. For Epictetus, prohairesis was the most fundamental human freedom, the one thing that could never be taken from a person, but that could absolutely be abandoned through inattention. When prohairesis goes dormant, something deeply important is lost. Not capability, not function, authorship. The experience of being the genuine source of your own life, rather than a passenger inside it. And here's what that loss actually feels like from the inside. Not dramatic emptiness, not obvious suffering, something quieter and in some ways harder to name, a sense that your life is happening to you rather than being created by you, that events arrive and you respond, without a clear sense of an interior life that is genuinely directing any of it. You feel like you could be doing so much more. Not more tasks, not more achievements, more living, more genuine presence inside the moments that are already there, more actual contact with the experience of being alive rather than the efficient processing of it. That feeling is not a symptom of something missing in you. It's the most honest signal your interior life is capable of sending. It's the part of you that knows the difference between existing inside your life and being present in it, telling you clearly that the distance has grown too large to ignore. And the question isn't whether you can feel that distance. Clearly you can. The question is what you're willing to do about it. Waking up isn't changing your life. It's coming back to it. Finally, and this matters more than anything else in this video, waking up from autopilot is not what most people imagine it to be. It is not a dramatic transformation. It is not a decision to overhaul everything, abandon your current life, and start over somewhere completely different. It is not the discovery of some new, better version of yourself that has been waiting behind the one you've been living with. It's simpler than that, and more demanding. It's the practice of returning, again and again, without drama and without expectation of permanence, to conscious engagement with whatever is actually in front of you, the conversation you're having, the meal you're eating, the decision you're making, the moment you're inside, right now, as it's actually happening. That's it. That's the whole thing. And it sounds almost disappointingly simple until you try to sustain it and discover how relentlessly the pull toward autopilot reasserts itself. How quickly the familiar patterns reload. How naturally the mind drifts toward automation the moment conscious attention is relaxed. Marcus Aurelius understood this completely. The meditations are, in their deepest structure, a record of someone practicing this return. Book after book of a man reminding himself, not once, not twice, but constantly, to come back, to be here, to engage with what is real rather than what is automatic. In the Meditations, Book 8, paragraph 7, he wrote that it is enough to do good now, even though I will not remember it. That line reveals something essential about the Stoic understanding of presence. It is not about creating memorable experiences. It is not about optimization or productivity or becoming a better version of yourself for some future payoff. It is about the quality of engagement in this moment, because this moment is the only place where life is actually happening. The opposite of autopilot is not perfect consciousness. It's not some enlightened state of perpetual awareness that, once achieved, never slips. The opposite of autopilot is simply the willingness to notice when you've drifted and to return, without self-judgment, without elaborate psychological analysis of why the drift happened, just the quiet, repeated act of coming back. And here's what changes when that practice becomes real. Not the external shape of your life, necessarily. Not your circumstances or your schedule or the demands on your time. What changes is the texture of your experience inside those circumstances. The days stop compressing into indistinct weeks. Moments start to leave traces. Conversations begin to feel like actual contact rather than performance. The life you've been technically living starts to feel genuinely like yours. You were never really lost. You were always here. You just spent a long time somewhere else while your life kept moving without you. And coming back doesn't require a new life. It only requires the decision, made today and again tomorrow and again the day after, to actually be present in the one you already have.